Hi, this is Irv Shapiro with the Make with Tech channel, formerly the Dr. Vax channel, and I'm the same guy. And here on the Make with Tech channel, what we do is we teach people how to use desktop technologies, ranging from 3D printers to electronics, a little bit of programming, a little bit of woodworking, and we teach people how to use these technologies to make things. Interesting things that might range from toys for their children to functional shelf brackets or replacement parts for appliances. Today, we're going to talk about two very big printers, but large in a different way. This is a large format printer. It's a dual material large format printer called the IDEX D Pro from JG Maker. And behind me, we have the FlashForge Creator Pro 2, also a dual material printer that is physically large and actually, I believe, heavier than this printer because it's fully enclosed. So we're going to compare these two independent dual extruder printers and help you to understand where the IDEX D is the printer you should choose and when the Creator Pro 2 is the printer you should choose. So stay tuned and let's learn something together. Before we get started, I wanted to let people know that if you're new to this channel, to Make with Tech, that was formerly the Dr. Vax channel, I publish anywhere from 2 to 6 times a month, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And all my videos are designed to help you learn new things at a pace that folks that are not technologists by profession are able to understand. So if you want to know about new videos as they come out, just subscribe to the channel, click on that bell so you'll be notified, and feel free to share these videos on social media with anyone you like. All of my videos are completely free. Now let's look at a slide together and begin our comparison of these two 3D printers. First of all, they are priced approximately the same. Depending on the day of the week or the day of the month, the prices go up or down a little bit. They sell for, let's say, $550 to $600. The JG Maker IDEX D Pro is a large printer at 310 by 310 by 350 millimeters, while the print area on the Creator Pro 2 from FlashForge is quite a bit more modest. Now, to give you a sense of that, this is the print bed on the FlashForge printer. And let me take it off here. This is the print bed on the IDEX D Pro. So you can see the IDEX D Pro is quite a bit larger. Now, depending on what you're printing, it won't matter. If you're printing relatively small items, it's not going to matter. If you're looking to print a large vase, as an example, you need a larger print area. And we're going to see that some of the features built into IDEX 3D printers work better with a large print area. So stay tuned for that. I'll explain why as we go along, but the JG Maker printer is really designed for what I'd call enthusiasts. Those are hobbyists that are serious about the craft, or you're using it in some type of light business prototyping process, but you're very willing to tinker with it. The JG Maker takes a lot of tinkering just to get it started. Whereas the FlashForge printers are really designed for pure hobbyists, or even in maybe an educational setting in a library, where you want it to be more like an appliance. Now, an appliance that has a startup feature, I like to think of it like a sewing machine. You get a sewing machine, somebody still has to teach you how to thread the machine, how to switch between stitches. You have to learn a lot of stuff to use a sewing machine effectively. But you don't have to tinker with it. You don't have to get your screwdriver and pliers out. That's really how the FlashForge printer is. It's really a consumer-grade hobbyist device. They're both IDEX printers. Now let's look at the JG Maker for a minute to help explain that. What that means is they have dual print mechanisms. A print head that consists of an extruder. They're both direct extruder. They have dual sets of nozzles, heating elements, hot ends. And they share an X-axis. Now you'll notice here that potentially these print heads could collide one with the other. So they have to be controlled appropriately. And we'll talk about that control and whether it's done in firmware or a slicer, and it varies on the two printers. Both of these printers use manual bed leveling. The JG Maker is a little trickier, and it has 4 knobs for the 4 corners, whereas the FlashForge printer is a much smaller print bed, remember, so it only has 3 because it doesn't need 4 because it's much smaller. In general, if you don't need the size, a smaller printer is easier to work with. It's easier to level, it's easier to control in many ways. The JG Maker Artist D Pro has a filament out sensor, and I'll show you a close-up picture of this. And some people don't use those because they do put a little bit of tension on the filament. And that tension can potentially affect the quality of your extrusion. And one of the major complaints about this printer, at least the non-pro model, is that it sometimes under extrudes. And there are a number of hacks, things you can do to solve that problem. Now, to be honest, on my Artist D Pro, I've had no under extrusion problems. I don't know if it's because the Pros were manufactured more recently and they resolved manufacturing issues, or they're actually slightly different in some way that resolves that issue. Finally, 2 other differences are the Artist D has dual Z axes. Now, because the print bed is so big, that really makes a lot of sense, because the X carriage has to span a large distance. The FlashForge printer has a single Z axis. So they both use this rod style axis, but on this printer there are 2 independent stepper motors and they're tied together with a belt at the top. It's a very robust architecture. The FlashForge printer is fully enclosed. It's called fully enclosed, but there's a big opening to let warm air out and there's no exhaust fan. So yes, it will control temperature better for specialized filaments like ABS. However, for PLA, they recommend leaving the door open and taking the top off because PLA needs better airflow to cool appropriately. So for many people, the fact it's fully enclosed won't make a big difference. Also, because it's not completely sealed with internal fans that you can exhaust outside, from an environmental point of view, the full enclosure doesn't buy you anything. So what does it buy you? 2 things. The printer is more rigid, which helps with print quality, and it's better protected from children's hands and pets, other things in the environment. Now, before we proceed to go into more details about these specific printers, let's look at a checklist of things you need to think about with IDEX printers in general. As I mentioned, IDEX printers have dual heads. That means that everything you need to do with a single material printer, you need to do twice with a dual material printer. You have to align the height of the nozzle to the print surface. You have to ensure that it's feeding filament correctly. You have to ensure that you get the right temperature for the right filament. And that actually is more complex because IDEX printers are not 2-color printers. Yes, you can print beautiful 2-color prints. In fact, this one recently printed on the JG Maker Artist D Pro is one of my favorites. I'll show you a close-up of this. But that's not the only thing you can do with these printers. The two materials you use in these printers does not have to be the same plastic, because you can set the temperature of the two nozzles separately. And depending on the slicer you're using in your 3D printer, you can set feed rate and other characteristics differently. So one of the things you're able to do is to create prints that have very fine detail, because the supports that you use on the prints, and let me show you a picture of that, the supports can be made of dissolvable filament. That's filament that is water soluble. It means that you print your supports like you normally would, then you soak it in warm water, you shake it around a little bit, you take it out, and the supports are basically gone. There'll be a little bit of sort of goo left on your print, and I find a soft toothbrush is all I need with a little more warm water to clean off a print. So this print, which requires supports in order to print beautifully, came out much better on my IDEX printer than it did when printed with traditional supports. With traditional supports, you often use a diagonal cutter or maybe a hot knife to clean off, or even sandpaper to clean off the support attachments. That leaves scarring in the plastic. So if you're going to prime it and paint it, it won't matter. But if you like to leave your prints somewhat natural, and I really do, it'll make a big difference. So dissolvable supports, for me, are a more significant advantage than multicolor, which is a bit of a novelty and fun for the kids, but you're not producing fine art on one of these printers. Now this list is a list of features that differentiate IDEX printers. And we're going to go through them now one by one and compare these two printers. Let's start with filament management. One of the challenges is that only one of these print heads is often moving at the same time. Now it depends on the mode you're using your printer in. If you in essence divide your printer in two and you're printing two things side by side, we'll talk about that in a moment, then both heads are moving and this limitation doesn't apply. But if you're printing something like this or like this, then as you print an individual layer, you first print with one print head, then it moves out of the way and you print with the other print head. But the print head that's moved out of the way is still hot. Now, depending on your slicer, you can reduce the temperature, but if you reduce it too much, when you go to heat it back up, you have to wait a long time. That will also impact the quality of your print, because when you put one color on top of another, you want the underlying color to still be warm to get better adhesion between the filaments. So you keep your idle print head warm, and what happens? Filament drips from the print head. Now, there are a number of strategies you can use in a slicer to resolve that. One is to print a wall around your print. Basically, think of it as a cylinder around your print, and each time you go to switch print heads, the new print head comes in, wipes against that wall before printing your actual object. Now, in addition to that, though, there are hardware things that can be done. One is, on the JG Maker, there are a series of brushes. I'll show you a close-up of these. And the print head wipes against the brushes each time it moves in and out. Now, ideally, it appears on the JG Maker, it should wipe against the brush, and then the print head should be over the open area. But this mechanism doesn't let it go that far. So I don't know if it was a manufacturing oversight. Some people have tried to adjust their firmware, but physically it can't go far enough over. So the solution is probably to replace these filament bins with something where the brush is a little bit further over. The FlashForge Creator Pro 2 uses a very different approach. As you can see on the right-hand side of this picture, The FlashForge has a metal plate, and the print head actually rests on the plate. The plate is a soft enough metal that it's a little springy, so it presses up on the nozzle. It in essence holds the nozzle closed. Now, at first, when I was looking at these two printers on paper, I thought the Artist D would be a much better approach. In fact, I find the FlashForge does a better job of reducing stringing from filament leaking out of the second nozzle. Now, let's talk about modes of operation. There are three ways you generally use an IDEX printer. One is you print two colors at once. That we've talked about a little bit already. The other is you effectively divide your print area in two, and you print two identical prints or two mirrored prints at the same time. So you're printing on the same layer on the same time. It doesn't have to be the same color, doesn't have to be the same filament, because you can set the temperatures different. But as it finishes the layer, it moves up, then it prints the two on the next layer. Moves up, two on the next layer. In duplicate mode, they're both identical. In mirror mode, they're mirror opposites of one another. Now, when you're printing two prints at once, the size of your print surface makes a really big difference. So you can only really do that with small objects on the Creator Pro 2. You can do that with very large objects on the Artist D. And because the Artist D also has a very high gantry, a very high Z-axis, you could actually print two vases, as an example, side by side on the Artist D. That means for somebody who's buying an IDEX printer to increase their productivity, the JG Maker is probably a better printer to purchase. Now, how do you control modes? Well, in the Artist D, it's done in firmware. You can set it in full control mode, in which case the slicer has to tell the idle printhead to move out of the way before it moves the second printhead when you're printing in dual color mode. If the slicer does not have the ability to do that, and it's usually done by adding specialized G-code on what's called tool changes, your printheads are going to crash into each other. That's called full control. The mode I use most often in multicolor prints on this printer is auto park mode. And so if you go to the front panel and you switch it to auto park mode, anytime the slicer says to switch toolhead, the other toolhead will go and sit over the brushes. That's a very safe way to use this printer. And then on the Artist D, you have the ability in firmware to select duplicate or mirror mode. In which case, in your slicer, you just put an object, a single color object, on one half of the build plate. Right in your slicer, you put it on one side. It will automatically, in firmware, duplicate it to the other side. Now, on the FlashForge printer, that's all controlled from the slicer. So you need to either use FlashPrint or another slicer that can handle full control of your printer. Simplify 3D has historically been used with FlashForge printers. I haven't tried it yet. I want to do a whole new review on Simplify 3D in the future when they come out with their new release, which is somewhat imminent, and at which point I'll test it with both regular printers and IDEX printers. So for me, I've used FlashPrint for the majority of my prints, including as an example this vase and vase mode, on my FlashForge printer. I'd say the quality is good. It's not the best I've seen, but the quality is good. The one area I've had some difficulty is with very fine detail, like lettering in small fonts, and I'm still experimenting with how to resolve that. In the case of the JG Maker printer, I've been using mostly Idea Maker from Raise 3D, which is a really good slicer. I've also used it with Cura, but Idea Maker has some more advanced features that make it easier to use with an IDEX 3D printer. On an IDEX printer, because you have two print heads, You have two nozzles and you have to control the Z height on both. In the case of the JG Maker Artist D Pro, only has the ability to adjust the Z height overall and to adjust an offset for the second print head. For the overall adjustment, there's a screw, a bolt that you raise up and down that triggers a limit switch. Then you can adjust the Z offset from that overall adjustment for the second nozzle, but you also can adjust it manually. So I find adjusting them both manually to get them really pretty good is the best way to go. And then if you have to fine tune it with the Z offset, you can use that next. On the right hand side of this picture, you'll see that on the FlashForge printer, you actually have a wizard for Z offset and you adjust the Z offset of each nozzle independently. It's very well done, with one caveat. After you're done adjusting it, I couldn't find any way to go back in and look at what the two numbers were set to. If I went back to the wizard, it started the wizard over again. Now the wizard works well, but I sort of like to be able to manually set the numbers. However, that may not be compatible with FlashForge's overall perspective of making this more like an appliance, sort of hiding some of the details from you. In addition to setting the nozzle height for two nozzles, you also have to make sure the nozzles are aligned on the y-axis and properly on the x-axis. And you do that by printing samples like these. And these look almost identical. They were printed from the two printers. And what you want to look for, and you'll see this in the close-up, is that the edges all align properly. And here's another alignment tool you can use. I'll show you this also in a close-up. And you want to make sure that the colors just meet each other. On the Z-axis, on the height, one color isn't higher than the other. When you get them perfect, you end up with beautiful prints that look like this. But it's hard to do. Now, on the JG Maker printer, you manually enter in these offsets. Once again, for the FlashForge printer, you use a wizard. It literally prints multiple lines, and you make sure the lines are aligned properly in both directions. And if not, it does have the ability to adjust those offsets using the wizard. Once again, once you're done adjusting it, you can't see the numbers. They're magically hidden. This slide highlights this concept even more. So parameters such as stepper motor adjustments, the amount of filament to extrude when loading filament, the X, Y, and Z offsets are all visible on the JG Maker, which is just using a variant of Marlin 2.0 build. And there are also already open source downloads of updated Marlin firmware for this printer. FlashForge is using a modified version of another open source project that's similar to Marlin, but a different team of people working on it, called Sailfish. And it comes from the MakerBot folks. They were the original folks to help promote Sailfish. When we look at the physical construction of the printers, we obviously have the much larger print area on the JG Maker printer, but it's also an open printer. I like open printers. Personally, I like them because they're easy to work on. I can get to everything. In fact, when appropriate, meaning I don't need quite the same quality, all the same materials, I prefer for beginners a Bowden tube setup because it's easier to get to the extruder to work on it. In the case of the FlashForge printer, it's fully enclosed. Now, I haven't tried to disassemble it yet, but I've tried to disassemble other fully enclosed printers. Some of them just take it could take you an hour just to get to some belts to adjust them. The belts, the gears, everything on this JG Maker printer are right there. It's easy to adjust. On the FlashForge, if you need to do repairs, it's going to be a little more difficult. Think appliance. Repairing your washing machine is not easy. You got to take a bunch of panels off. On the other hand, repairing a bicycle where it's open is much easier. So what's the advantage of the FlashForge? Well, it is a printer because of better temperature control that is more appropriate for materials like ABS. And as I mentioned earlier, it's safer if you have children around. Not completely safe. They can open the door, but safer for children, and you won't have pets clawing at the printhead. 3D printers need slicers to function. Slicers that take a 3D drawing, a 3D object, and convert it into G code or similar to G code, and then allow you to print it layer by layer. Well, JG Maker is based on Marlin, so any of your standard slicers can be used with the JG Maker printer. Because they control much of the IDEX capabilities in firmware, your printer doesn't necessarily even need to know a lot about multi-material printers. It does have to have controls for two materials for temperatures, but it doesn't have to know about the modes or give you the abilities to program in the mode. The FlashForge printer also uses a variant of G code, but it's a special variant. The files you send to the FlashForge printer have a binary header on them, but it means you just can't take Cura, plug it in, and go. You need to do some special things to make them all work together. So far, I've only used FlashPrint with my FlashForge printer, and it is an integrated ecosystem. FlashPrint is designed to use with Sailfish build that is used with the FlashForge printer. It all works together tightly, and it does make it feel very appliance-like. Once again, you can use other slicers, but it takes a bit more work, and I'll talk about that probably in a future video. Now, what about quality? Well, I generally can't tell the difference, with the exception that for very fine detail, I think the FlashPrint slicer does not do as good of a job as IdeaMaker or Cura. Now, I am going to test Simplify 3D with this printer in the future to resolve that issue, and it may be I just have a setting wrong in FlashPrint. But overall, the quality is pretty much identical. I've been able to print beautiful prints on both printers, and been able to print multicolor prints that work out very nicely on both printers. So in terms of quality, I wouldn't select one over the other because of quality. I also wouldn't select one over the other because of speed. Now, I haven't done a lot of testing, but overall they're both faster printers than a Bodum type setup, with one exception. If you're printing in dual color mode, all of those moves to move a printhead out of the way, print with one printhead, move it out of the way, print with the other, they take time, and they can add 25 to 50% to your overall print time versus single color prints. So what's my conclusion? Well, let's look at this slide together. As I mentioned, I think this is an enthusiast printer. You're going to have to be a tinker to love this printer. I'm a tinker. I love this printer. I think it's very modifiable, very hackable. I've already downloaded new firmware to it that did not come from JG Maker, that was updated by the community. There are some potential known issues with the earlier batches of these printers. People were having trouble with under extrusion. I haven't seen that. In terms of the FlashForge, it's a hobbyist appliance. There's an integrated slicer, firmware, and printer. They even provide their own filament that's on a slightly proprietary reel. You can use standard reels on the printer, but their proprietary reels lock in on the back a little bit tighter. So if you want something you can take out of the box, I'd consider a FlashForge printer. In fact, they have a new printer called the AD4 coming out in September I'm hoping to take a look at. I think for a lot of hobbyists, FlashForge is going to be a very good choice. For appliance style printers. If you need a larger print area, you need to go with this printer. If you're going to use the printer in an environment with younger children, maybe in a library or a school or a maker center, the fully enclosed printer, I think, has an advantage. But remember, it doesn't solve the environmental issues. You still need a well-ventilated space. In terms of value for the price, I think you're getting more printer because of the large print volume on this printer and the fact you can upgrade it more easily. Overall, I think they're both excellent printers, and you really need to understand your needs. Well, folks, I hope you learned something today. If you did, subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, share this video with everyone you know, and make sure you go to forum.makewithtech.com where you can post pictures of your own prints and you can discuss with over 1,000 kind and helpful people the videos I make. Thanks so much. Also, feel free to leave comments below, and let's continue to learn something together.